Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cluster API provider Azure, CapZ. We're here meeting on our weekly office hours cadence. Today's April 18th on a Thursday. I see only familiar faces, so we'll be nice and short and sweet and perfunctory. Disclaimer announcement about CapZ being a SIG cluster lifecycle project. We abide by the CNCF code of conduct. We welcome all voices, but please be kind, raise hands to speak. And without further ado, I don't see anyone new, so we can skip past the welcome attendees. If you're watching this recording, anytime you come by for the first time, we'd love to hear who you are, why you're using CapZ or Cluster API, where you work for, anything at all. But for now, we have a very light agenda item. I think I can go ahead and announce the CapZ patch releases that we cut last week. So 1.14.2 and 1.13.4 are available for folks. This was kind of on the weekly cadence for a patch release. There was a single fix to address MSI use cases when the assigned identity, user assigned identity, is a part of a different subscription than the workload cluster. So that was determined to be appropriately classified as a bug. So that fixes out in those two releases. Release notes will reflect that. And actually, I'll give Matt an opportunity. I see you, Matt, to announce this next bullet point item because you did that work.
Thanks, Jack. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the CAPI minor releases have proven in the past to be more disruptive and take a little more effort than we expected. So this time we stayed on top of it for the entire month and a half release cycle and then merged it. So 1.7.0 support is in there. It wasn't a drastic amount of change. And then users will be able to benefit from that in about a little over 2 weeks when we plan to do the next minor release. That's it for the record.
Cool. Any further ad hoc announcements, agenda items before we give our time back? Hey, David. All right, I move to give folks 52 minutes of their time back.
Hi.
Call this short and sweet.
Hi. Sorry to interrupt that, but I would like to discuss the Helm chart PR, if that's
Great.
okay.
Go ahead, the floor is yours. I'm going to add that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to check. I mean, we could look at the PR. Nellie's made some updates. I just want to see if there's any reservations or if there's things that need to be changed, we think.
Go ahead, Matt.
I reviewed it like a lot of us did, and I was taking the point of view that this is already something we definitely want to have in there. I hadn't really taken a step back, but Jack, you were talking yesterday about, do we really want to take this on given that its scope is pretty restricted and people would justifiably expect to stumble into the project and be like, oh, there's a Helm chart here. Great, I can deploy CapZ in a variety of ways, but no, it's actually quite restricted to just AKS, managed clusters, and even some within that. So I don't know, I'm a little torn because I don't want Nellie and other people to spend a whole lot more time on it if it's not something we actually want. So maybe that's where the conversation should be. That's all.
Yeah, cool.
So yeah, I mean, I think.
Go ahead, David.
Go ahead.
No, you
I
go
mean,
ahead.
I think. I guess the general concept. I want to make sure, Helm charts that do self-managed. I feel like it would be have that as a separate chart, because usually you're not doing both together. Like you're picking one path there.
You're breaking up. You want to wait a second, then
I was saying that I think I think that that was all I had. I mean, I think that we could have two, a chart for self-managed and then a chart for managed. And then that would cover all the bases. Like if down the road, right? Like if there was demand for a self-managed chart, that could be added in later.
right. I think that that's fine. I think that the key to accepting a PR like this would be making it, basically anything that's going to be hosted in the CAPZ repository, to me, becomes an integral contract that's part of CAPZ. And so if we're going to do a Helm chart or multiple Helm charts, then it becomes a part of the user platform contract. And so we would want to test it ourselves. I think to the extent that we would just host a Helm chart as practical, I mean, like as a way of helping out a single solution is definitely practical, and I'm open to that. But I think we would want to be aware that that's not the norm. Like the norm, in my experience, in projects is that the Helm chart becomes the canonical way to interface with the project. And so we would want to disclaim that. And I wonder what the value of that is, especially from a practical point of view. There's no practical benefit to hosting a Helm chart that does a specific thing in the CAPZ repo versus some other repo. Like if the Helm project is designed to be distributed in that way, that's a core principle. And so if the Helm interface unlocks a particular use case for CAPZ, then it would be totally normal and equivalently useful for that Helm chart to be elsewhere, not as like a part of the CAPZ project. So that's the resistance that I have of merging a Helm chart that doesn't meet that bar of like fully supported by the project.
Okay.
Go ahead, John H.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah, just to go off of what Jack said, and like a Helm chart becoming the canonical way to do things. I just want to make sure that like we caution ourselves to make sure that we don't somehow back ourselves into a corner where like the Helm chart is the only way you can possibly get things to work in a sane way, because CAPZ at its core is essentially just the API, and CAPZ itself shouldn't have any opinions as to how you invoke that API that Helm might introduce. So I can't imagine how we would actually back ourselves into that kind of corner, but I think that's something to be aware of, that like we still kind of need CAPZ to be available in all those other sort of form factors, if it's just raw YAML or with Go clients or whatever.
go ahead, David T. I think you're next.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's fine. But I would say I do think we should have a formally supported, not a, I mean, if I thought that having a Helm chart in somebody's personal repo was enough, I mean, I wouldn't have filed the issue a long time ago. Right. So yeah, I think it's something we should officially support. Whether the code itself is in this actual repo versus some other official repo, I'm open to that, but it seems like it makes logical sense that it's paired with the repo where the code is at, and the other templates for the flavors and all the other things. It seems like it would be a bit of an additional overhead to have an entirely separate repository for it. I get the independence and the maintenance side of that choice, but I don't expect us to have an overwhelming amount of contributions to the Helm chart repo. I mean, certainly I think there'll be more iterations in the near term, but yeah, I don't see it as a significant overhead or burden in terms of having now a chart along with the code repo. That's just my opinion.
Go ahead, Matt.
I agree. If we want people to use it and we want it to be legit, it should probably live in CAPC itself. It's just the situation we're talking about a little earlier, I think, is actually quite likely where this solves like the 80% or 90% use case because we know everyone's using managed clusters by and large. And then maybe the demand never materializes and we never can justify making the other chart. We're left in a situation, which I think is fairly likely. We're left in a situation where people come into the project and they look for the Helm chart, and then it's confusing just because it doesn't support a plurality of use cases. And again, these, as far as we can tell, this is the minority of users, but still, I think it's a good argument that it would be confusing. So we'd have to just acknowledge that and document it cleanly that this is not the full solution. But if it is in CAPC, which I think it probably ought to be, this is actually John's point from yesterday, kind of contrary to what he was saying this morning, for it to, or counterpoint to what he just said. If it's legit, then we need to be using it, because if it's just sitting there and customers are using it, and we're not actually dogfooding it ourselves, or at the very least have some E2E tests using it, it's going to break, and we won't know that, and it'll be kind of orthogonal to our agenda with CAPC, since it'll be an annoyance. You know, we'll have to fix the chart. We're not using the chart. We're not dogfooding the chart. So,
Yeah.
So long story short, this does imply more work. We would have at the very least have to have E2E tests around it.
Yep. No, I get that.
Yeah,
I would say.
Go ahead, David.
Go ahead.
No, you can respond to that, and then I'll add some comments.
So
as well.
I was gonna say I also think like I think it's on the table as well if we're adding more work with the Helm stuff, which we would be. I get it. To reconsider all the various AKS managed flavors that we have there and maybe reduce those down to counterbalance the additional work on the Helm chart. That's just an idea.
So here's the thing about maintenance. I think to do this the right way, which is the way that I would certainly only vote, whatever my vote counts for, I would only vote that we do this the right way. To do this the right way in terms of maintenance, this would be additive tests, because we can't replace the current raw API tests with Helm tests, because we can't we just can't as a project be cluster API idiomatic and say, oh, the only way that we know that works is if you use Helm. We can't do that. So we have to continue testing without Helm, because there's going to be users who there's no Helm story for them. And so that's definitely a lot of extra, just one-time sort of capital expenditure in terms of setting up additional tests that are going to test specific Helm scenarios that we're going to support. But keeping that split API contract, so now we're like splitting out. We now have two API contracts. We have the core API contract, and now we have we're going to publish a Helm chart which exposes its own interface. So we have to keep those both like moving forward in sync. So that's a non-trivial amount of permanent maintenance cost in my experience, to make sure that we don't, the wrong way to do it would be, for example, let's say there's a particular combinatoric that makes the most sense for a user. It might be super convenient to do that in Helm and say, actually, we're going to provide this UX happy path in Helm only, but it's not in the API. Whereas now we make sure to put that into the API. So that's a risk that we incur. And in order to do that right going forward, we have to do that now in two places. Or we have to make sure that it's at least integrally in the API. Maybe we can skip. I think the Helm you could argue that that's optional. But the point is that weighing all those things as we move forward is non-trivial, and it's definitely a permanent addition to our sort of maintenance burden for the project. And the final point I'll say is that this is really not what Helm was designed for. Helm was designed to be able to package up different sets of Kubernetes resources that aren't already rationalized in a common API like we have in CAPC and Cluster API. And so it's a little edge casey just in itself to use Helm to protect an API that already has as a first class requirement. Like anytime we're evolving the actual core CAPC APIs, they all have to evolve together. They have to make sense together. They're rationalized together. They're already, in a sense, packaged. There is already tons and tons of business logic in place to ensure that a particular representation of, say, an Azure managed cluster and an Azure managed control plane and an Azure managed machine pool and a machine pool and a cloud, all those things are already sort of, the packaging is already provided inside the API itself. Like we already have lots of logic that makes sure that those sets of resources are rationalized as a set. So Helm was really originally designed for composing sets of resources together that have no other way to do that. So if I'm writing like a CNI project, I might need to package together a bunch of primitives that are parts of separate projects that can be packaged together in lots of different interesting ways. Like, for example, I can use one project just by itself, and so that project maintains its API in a discrete way. But potentially there's another solution where I can reuse that project, combine it with 3 other projects, and use Helm to provide my users a convenient way of interfacing with that composed solution in, using a standard API and a standard flow. I just want to call out that the way we're using Helm here is not a part of that solution, and it's a little edge casey. So I know that was a lot. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, to kind of go off of the Helm being a purely additive thing, I don't think the EDE tests necessarily assume anything about the templates other than that they're YAML with environment variable templates. So I guess in theory, it seems like we could use Helm to generate the test templates and then use those templates in our tests and then also ship the chart that you can use separately. I'm not super convinced that that's actually less work overall than just maintaining a separate Helm chart, but there might be some tricks there where we don't need.
You mean kind of
like
replace
purely
customize the stuff we use customize with,
right?
Use Helm
Yep.
instead. Yeah, we've talked about that in the past. I think that could be. It's hard to calculate the ROI. It does make sense that in the long term, if we did that work, we'd be happier because we're all a little bit more familiar with Helm. It's a little simpler than customize, I think, but it would require some upfront cost to make that conversion. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I do think it's worth, again, rationalizing the various managed server flavors. And I don't know. I mean, if we're testing every single flavor or we're just generating the templates, do we know that?
We're definitely not testing every flavor. 100% no.
Okay. So then, yeah, in my opinion, that's easy opportunity if that functionality is available in the in the Helm chart. Like, we don't need, I don't know how many flavors of managed cluster we have in there, but that we can, I'm not saying get rid of them altogether, but let's say have one AKS flavor template or something like that, or 2 that's there, and then just point over to the Helm chart for the other ones to reduce the burden. But in terms of your hypothetical, what's Helm for? I mean, I think yeah, obviously that is one thing that Helm is for, but I think Helm also is very much for many other things in a normal use case. So I wouldn't say that we're doing something very odd and strange here. In fact, most users, many users that I know go to write their own Helm chart for this purpose anyways. And so then we have lots and lots of people doing this same thing. And then, yeah, that adds additional steps for people to have to do for every single person that wants, to maintain their own Helm chart to run our stuff out there.
I 100% agree. It's really the being in part of the CAPC project that's the trigger for my skepticism. 100% agree. I think that Helm, in terms of being a tool that, when integrated into a full end-to-end solution that includes things like CAPI and CAPZ to make things easier, makes perfect sense. Putting it into the CAPZ repo or putting it into the CAPI repo is you have to inherit the historical baggage of what that communicates to the naive user, which is that Helm is now like an integral part of that project. It's like the way to install the project. And we've talked about this with Cluster API many times over the years, and it's always a hard no. Like there are lots of folks who, and even the folks who are resistant to say replacing cluster CTL with something else, acknowledge the limitations of cluster CTL. But that is it's been sort of blessed as the way to install cluster API and provider components. So I have absolutely no objection to someone with a vertical CAPZ integration story writing a Helm chart to capture CAPZ. That makes perfect sense. It's putting it into the CAPZ repo and what that means for, like, as the maintainer community of CAPZ, everything that goes into CAPZ, we have to maintain that. And
Yep.
that's,
I get that
that's
there's a cost to that.
That's what I'm not convinced of yet. Did Jonathan, did you raise your hand? Or did I see something else? Good. If you're raising your hand to speak, David, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I totally understand there's an overhead. Yeah. I guess so. Are we still unsure of moving forward on the PR that's up there then? Or where are we at then, I guess, with that?
I'm not convinced that it's right for the CAPZ project. I am super happy to provide some. I mean, I'm just one vote, so I don't get to say what happens. My vote is I would prefer that a Helm chart like this be hosted somewhere else inside the end-to-end solution, for example, that's using this. That seems super idiomatic, and Helm is definitely designed for that, for writing your own Helm charts to capture a particular use case. I'm like it seems like this hasn't been stated explicitly, but it seems like the value of it being in CAPZ is that it communicates to folks, it gives more confidence to folks using this particular end-to-end solution that this is supported. And that's literally my concern, is that confidence comes at a cost, and the cost is that we have to add a lot of disclaimer materials and we have to support it forever and somehow integrate it into the existing thing with our existing API tests. And that doesn't sound like it's worth it. I would suggest that we don't need to put it in CAPZ in order to instill user confidence in using a Helm chart that's hosted elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think so. I think you do need something that's official, whether it's in this repo or not. But I do think that it's an important step. And I also would say that in terms of your comments about CAPI and the cluster CTL being the definitive way, I've, at least since I've been here in a year and a half, it feels like that's changing with the fact that the cluster API operator now is an official top level alternate production ready way that has been agreed upon to deploy cluster API, and that it uses only a Helm chart. So it seems to me like maybe things have shifted since when you were around on the project, but like that this would be a lot like logical like continuation of that by having a provider support a Helm chart. Although I know we're blazing the trails and being probably the first one to do that, I wouldn't be surprised if others would follow in that same direction down the road. So, yeah.
Go ahead, John.
I completely forgot what I was going to say. I will throw that in chat if I remember.
Well, that'll be preserved in the recording forever. John.
Guess what? So I remembered. So what's the risk in if we do have a separate Helm chart that's not hosted in somewhere that looks obviously official, if we CAPZ say something like, here is a Helm chart that exists that might do what you want, feel free to take a look, without committing to any support for that? Is there much risk in us doing that, just to at least, if people are looking for a Helm chart, they could probably find it from CAPZ, but we kind of absolve ourselves of committing to like robust support for that.
I think what it would look like to me is just adding that disclaimer material in the README and probably including an owner's file and having someone, like, I think having, if we don't commit to maintain it, someone needs to maintain it. So I think if Nelly and folks wanted to be in the owner's file, and it was in a directory that communicated this is a thing that is useful for this particular reason, then that would be a compromise. If that fulfills what you want, Dave, I'm not sure that that's the thing that communicates the confidence that you're looking for, David, in terms of being a part of the official repo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the challenge, right? Is maintaining a Helm chart, and that's, I get the reservation, and that's why I have the reservation for it, because there is an overhead to maintaining and making it official, and I think that's what we need. And so whether that is something that is in this repo or it's in another Microsoft Azure repo, for instance, on GitHub, like I'm not strongly opinionated there. But what I don't think communicates the confidence for other people is just somebody's random repo that's out there, because there's been that, right? We've had that for quite some time. You know, which it doesn't get maintained. You know, Alessandro is the one who had a chart from 3 years ago, which is what this was based off of, and it wasn't maintained, and it didn't work, and required somebody to come along and update it. And that I don't think is going to change unless someone like our team comes in and says we're going to support this, right?
Yeah, but I would say I would respond to that that's just not part of the core CAPC charter. So whatever this is, I would defend that position that we don't want to support this. The only this that we would support is to me, is a Helm chart that does it the right way, which is a well thought out, fully feature complete, integrated Helm chart into the project. That to me is what would pass the bar of the CAPC maintainers accepting as net new maintenance material. I really do think that this is the canonical use case for writing your own Helm chart. If there's a problem with maintenance, then that's part of it. It's like the equivalent problem coming up with that vertical Helm chart. It's not something. Yeah.
So yeah. So I think you can be complete in. I'm sorry, I can't see the hands.
You're good.
Okay. I would say, like, I do believe if you scope it to manage cluster, you can have a feature complete scenario there where you feel good about that. I get the bigger scope of the self-managed side, but I like, per what Matt was saying earlier, I do think you could, you know, disclaim that or whatever, right? And you know, make it clear to people that that's not in scope for this chart. Because like I said, I have yet to see a user, maybe they're out there, that deploys self-managed and managed at the same time. Usually you're in one camp or the other. You're usually not in both. And then usually for the self-managed one, like per what I have on the issue, you've got so many variations and customizations to the thing that it does make it, you know, and you also are dealing with a different user set, people who want to get into the weeds with Kubernetes, that they're fine having a, you know, they're fine having a manually created, crafted template, because it's not like they're stamping out, you know, 50, 100 of, you know, different varieties of this self-managed cluster template, right? So there's less of a need for what Helm provides as well on that front. So I think there's many reasons why I think it's okay to not have the self-managed thing in the Helm chart, and us to feel okay about that.
Well, here's another thing. I'm sorry that I didn't bring this up earlier, but the other thing in terms of maintenance is Helm competes with the core CAPI functionality. So if I use Helm to more conveniently scaffold a cluster, what is the process that we recommend? As if we're going to attach it to the CAPC project, then we are probably going to say, so you could do this. This could give you a lighter touch initial gesture to create a cluster, but nothing in our official project documentation and guidance suggests that there's any other way to maintain a cluster from day 2 on other than interact with the native resources. And once you do that one time, you've disambiguated, you're now competing with Helm, because the cluster itself has a release object, and that means the next time someone does a Helm upgrade, they're going to overwrite everything that was changed on that day 2. Again, this is why I think that this is maybe appropriate for a vertical end-to-end solution, but it would have to account for that kind of thing. Like, because the base case is that there's now a kind of orphaned, and I mean in quotes because it's not really orphaned, but from a guidance point of view, you don't want to like create a V2 release of a Helm chart that represents a cluster API and CapZ cluster. Or even more interesting, let's say a fleet of 100 clusters. If I use Helm to make creating 100 clusters a super lightweight gesture, then we want to make sure that release gets destroyed as soon as possible. So you can't mess with that going forward. And Helm isn't really designed for that out of the box. Helm is designed to manage those sets of, it's designed to be the authoritative actor for managing state over time for the sets of resources that are in its chart. So that's another thing that like, this just doesn't feel like the right solution. I'm sorry to be super resistant. And again, I'm just one vote, but I feel like the right solution is for this. It seems like there's perfect justification for using a Helm chart to make creating lots of clusters easier in an end-to-end flow. I think that end-to-end flow should own that Helm chart, and including all those like second order side effects for what do you do after the clusters are up? How do you make sure that your source of truth is not dependent on Helm? And if it is dependent on Helm, if that's the idea, then we're in a difficult spot, because that means that as CapZ and CapE move forward, like upgrading the cluster, keeping that cluster current and upgrade hygienic using only the Helm release data model is going to require first-class coordination between the CapZ project and CapE and the Helm chart. And that's something I don't see the investment there, because that is even more non-trivial than what we've been discussing thus far in terms of maintenance. So that's a situation we don't want to get a user into, where they rely on the simplified Helm interface for maintaining like 100 production clusters or 1,000 production clusters. Because we just don't have that integrity in place, where every time we cut a CapZ release, we make sure that the full set of Helm chart combinatorics is forward and backwards compatible, which is what you have to do. Matt, didn't we do this with Deus Workflow back in the day when we initially came up with Helm? And it was like, it was we had to do that well, otherwise we were going to break folks.
Yeah, upgrade, and I'm having a hard time thinking about how this is going to cleanly handle upgrades at all, unless we do what you're talking about.
That's to me, that's like that's what Cluster API is for day 2. Yeah. It's not for day 1.
A Helm chart just naively seems to me like a great way for people to stumble into the project and try it out. But as Jack was saying, I wouldn't want to do that at a larger scale, I guess, with this particular project.
Yeah, I think I guess that is something, I mean, I haven't thought about, because I definitely have not thought like, oh, hey, I'm gonna use only Helm to upgrade a large number of clusters. Like that's not I don't think a primary use case that I have in mind.
Well, it's not upgrade, it's maintain. It's not maintain. Like how if you're using Helm to create the cluster, how do you update the kubelet config, for example? Or how do you update if you're not using an autoscaler, how do you update the replica count? Are you using the Helm? Are you using Helm to do that? Are you updating the Helm values from, say, if there's an array of machine pools exposed as a Helm values property? Are you updating your first array index for your machine pool from 5 to 7 and then relying on Helm upgrade to carry that configuration change out?
No, I mean, in the GitOps workflow, right, you would still use the Helm chart and you would update those things, but then that would get translated. It would generate the template into raw YAML that then gets applied, right? You wouldn't actually use Helm itself, right? The GitOps agent would render the manifests from the template to then apply that value file being updated and pushed out.
Right, but that's a yes to my question. So you're relying on Helm to carry out that change under the hood. Helm is going to be the actor that abstracts away the full cluster API contract from the user. So they don't have to worry about the machine pools and the Azure machine pools or the Azure managed machine pools data structure. They simply get the convenience of like, machine pools bracket 1 dot replicas equals, they just change that value from 3 to 5. And it's as simple as that. The problem is how does that not constrict the overall functional value proposition of Cluster API? Because the overall functional value proposition is that you can move your infrastructure forward. So when CAPI cuts a new release, you can move that forward. When CAPSI cuts a new release, you can move that forward. How do you do that in the context of a Helm chart without having the Helm chart be an integral part of the API contract and have that data translation work? So if I'm 6 months into my cluster lifecycle, so now I created the cluster with a Helm chart from 6 months ago that was rationalized against a version of cluster API and CAPSI from 6 months ago. The only way that 6 months after that I can continue doing that is if all the CAPI releases and all the CAPSI releases over that 6 month period have included that forward and backward compatibility integrity check from the actual Helm chart itself. And so it becomes a core API contract for the user. They have to be able to go ahead.
Sorry, you still are going to have that. I mean, let's just forget about the Helm chart. You're still going to have the same situation. You're going to still have this YAML file that you've been sitting there that you do have to also manually now go and check and make sure is okay as well.
We do check that. That's like a key part. That's like the work we do when we cut a release and we integrate during the dev cycle. We check all those things. We have
but if it's
mature tests to do that.
Right, but if it's in somebody's repo, what are they going to manually analyze whatever's updated to whatever they currently have that's being applied on the cluster? Like they're going to have to go and like look at compare the YAML and how it's different?
Well, we don't break the API, so that's part of the contract. But we also what I'm trying to point out something that is to a certain extent academic, but it's like the key part of the contract is that the CAPI and Cluster API expose a declarative configurable interface that is durable over time, and, following the sort of core principles of Kubernetes. So we have these strongly versioned APIs. So if we abstract those behind Helm, and Helm becomes the first class interface point between a user and their Cluster API and CAPC clusters, then that Helm chart has to inherit the same API contracts for forward and backward compatibility.
Unless you do versions, right, where you can say this version of the Helm chart is a breaking change, and then simper the Helm chart.
But that's
right.
Not, I understand what you're saying, but that means that a version of a Helm chart, that means you can't upgrade your CAPI cluster because your only deterministic, like rendered YAML template outcome is a particular version of a Helm chart that was validated against a particular version of CAPI and CAPC. So it means that users who are in that flow are operating at a restricted sort of feature set in terms of their Cluster API experience.
Yeah, I still don't see how that would be any different than them doing this manually the way it is today. Like I still see that they would have the similar kind of challenges if they were upgrading in number of versions past what we supported anyway. They would still have to go manually compare things and look at the YAML and see how it's different and see how my contract is now broken from how it was before. And now the only difference now is you have a Helm chart that tells you so. And
Yeah, no, I think that what you're saying is that the person supporting the Helm chart, the team supporting the Helm chart, the project supporting the Helm chart would take on that burden of making sure that that integrity is there. I don't think that the CAPC project is the place for that, because it's there's a lot of reasons why. It's a lot of maintenance work. It is non-idiomatic in terms of fulfilling the core API responsibilities of CAPC as a cluster API project. Like the core sets of responsibilities are fulfilling the cluster API. And I mean that like the API. I don't think the CAPC project is the place to do this. I think that is the place to gaming out those scenarios and making sure that it's forward and backwards compatibility in order to achieve additional UX convenience and power. That effort, that's where this Helm chart should be. We've talked about this for a long time. So I think the current state is, I'm not hearing any other voices. So the current state would probably be to communicate to Nelly that this is still under discussion, just so we don't string someone along. Again, I don't get to choose just based on my reservations. So I'd love to hear other folks weigh in and have a consensus, but that's my point of view at this point. Any responses? Does that not sound reasonable? Go ahead, Matt.
It does sound reasonable, and I think overall I'm persuaded that I mostly feel bad that there's been a lot of work going into this and ongoing, and I know Nelly pushed to commit this morning, but we may not want to. But saying at this point, hey, this is a great PR, can we rehost it over here, or could you just open up a repository and host it? Is maybe a slightly difficult conversation. I don't want her to waste more time if we really don't want this, but I'm mostly persuaded to Jack's point of view that this is a ongoing maintenance issue, and the optics of it are confusing if it's not going to support more or less everything CAPI does. And just the logic of upgrading through cluster cuddle is not something I think we can replicate successfully through Helm, however hard we try. So I don't know. I guess that's where I'm at. That's my little brain dump.
All right, Willie.
Yeah, I don't have too much experience with like maintaining Helm charts, but yeah, it will be like kind of a hard conversation if we tell them that they'll have to like host it themselves. But I think it's better to I mean in the long run, I think I'm persuaded that the maintenance might be kind of hard, and the work will still be like used for whoever wants to use the Helm chart. So I don't think it's like a worst case scenario, at least in the short term. So yeah.
so it sounds like we would be open to, let's say, even an Azure / CAPZ managed cluster type Helm chart or something like that.
I mean,
I
think the better way to put it is that we would be open to partner with wherever. So if someone is maintaining this and using CAPZ, that's super great. That's awesome. And I would want the folks maintaining that to be a part of the office hours and to be in regular communication. I would want to empower that solution, like the wrapping of CAPZ inside something that includes Helm and CAPI operator and Argo. That sounds fantastic. I want to partner with them. So not having a Helm chart like this be a part of the CAPC project doesn't mean we don't like it. It's sort of like the same position that the Kubernetes project would have towards, like, I want have a Helm chart and Q proxy, and then saying that we can't do that because we have a like go please host your Helm chart and Q or to install Q proxy. That's amazing, but we have to support our maintenance burden is to support the core Q proxy API and not to bless a particular Helm convenience. So it's the same thing where Azure sounds great, Microsoft sounds great, non-Microsoft sounds great. I think we would partner no matter where it was. I mean, someone made a comment in chat about SIG cluster lifecycle hosting. That could also be possible. I would say the way forward for something like this would probably be maybe the best pitch would be a new project to host cluster API Helm innovations. So it wouldn't just be for like CapZ, but it would be because that seems like it wouldn't necessarily be a super exciting proposal if I'm putting myself in the shoes of SIG cluster lifecycle. But maybe just a new project where a new sort of like feature group where people are talking about how they're using Helm to build like vertical happy solutions. And this could be one of those. I don't know if Nelly is interested in that kind of. I haven't been to the last few CAPI meetings. Has Nelly been present there? I'm not sure how active she is in CAPI, but that's the kind of thing someone could take on maybe.
Obviously, they're not at an infrastructure level necessarily, but it is implied in that same flow. So that would be the main. That would be really on that group that's already signing up for that, not because we have a chart that pushes out flavored AKS templates.
Right.
I do understand there's some implication of backwards compatibility, forward compatibility, and that I understand that concept, but it is not the overhead of the larger overhead and undertaking that cluster API operator group is doing, which is how does upgrading the Helm chart here, because that's what they're saying, it's production ready Helm chart for all the clusters out there, for the managed clusters to upgrade, including the infrastructure provider itself. That's a lot bigger burden that they're signing up for there. This is a lot smaller than that.
I didn't quite understand that, but that didn't sound like you said anything.
Yeah, well, core. Well, yeah. I mean, just the core like managed cluster upgrade is handled by the operator, not by this Helm chart.
Right, got it.
Right.
And I was just saying it as a possible repo, if there's a repo in SIG cluster lifecycle that could be basically a charts repo for SIG cluster lifecycle related or adjacent charts.
Yeah. And we could propose that to the groups. I mean, see what they'd say. But I mean, considering the one we have here is very Azure specific, not only to CapZ, but also to the AKS part, I would guess that they would be, unless there were other people wanting to contribute charts, they would be, why don't you just host it in Azure or somewhere else, right?
I think my response, if someone,
pushback.
Yeah, if someone had that response, my response would be, well, if like we don't know, there might actually, for example, if I'm someone who's like my story is CAPZ in particular, but it's the thing I'm about to say applies equally to every cluster API provider, and that thing is cluster API. Maintaining cluster API in production in terms of the data structure is super unwieldy, really complex. Having a Helm chart make this easier for me would be useful. If there were a Helm chart that did this for AWS or for VMware or whatever, that would be super awesome to know about as quickly as possible. I could just like literally use that as inspiration, copy pasta, and make the CAPC version. So the having a charts repo in SIG cluster lifecycle would allow that kind of collaboration to accelerate, where I could just hop on and be like, I'm thinking about doing a CAPC chart in this kind of interesting vertical way. Let's see how are other people doing CAPI charts in interesting vertical ways. So even if I like stumbled onto a Kappa chart, a lot of that stuff's going to be transferable, and I'm going to be able to sort of like skip some of that initial greenfield stuff, because like, oh, somebody's already done a lot of the hard work. Like this is how you abstract away a cluster API like API into a Helm chart. So that could be the pitch for a charts repo. And we could, and potentially, I mean, so David, you and I engaged and some other folks with the CAPI operator team to address some, I can't actually remember if it was a bug but anyway, we had some requirements that the chart was not making. And so we made some changes there, and they accepted it. And frankly, they were like, if you wanted to maintain this Helm chart, that'd be awesome. So we could probably use a project like that and say, we would like to, there's some like Helm chart work going on orthogonally, and it's hard to get consistent maintainers. We would like to get a new project to maintain all these charts in one place and have CI around them. And that could potentially make all of the projects like CAPI operator that have kind of very best effort Helm chart maintenance, but then fall behind for whatever reason because it's not a priority. That could potentially improve that situation for the whole set of SIG cluster lifecycle. Does that make sense as why it might be a good idea? Cool, we're at time.
Yeah.
Okay, I will post the recording. Happy Thursday, everyone. Friday if you're in Australasia. Signing off. See ya.
Have a good one.
Check. Good discussion.